Welcome to On the Move. Today, my guest is journalist Lydia Emmanouilidou. Thanks for joining the program, Lydia.
Thank you for having me.
I hope I told your last name correctly, but for
You
everyone
did.
else, it will be
A+.
on the website so people can see to look for your work. But I will just briefly introduce you. Lydia is an independent journalist based between Greece and the US, and she is a fellow at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. She was previously a Greece correspondent for the US public radio program The World. She is also currently researching and reporting on the impact of surveillance at borders in US and Greece. Welcome again, Lydia. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the Greek government, as most of my audiences have, heard until now, and the EU have evicted very self-managed hospitality structures like Pikpa camp in Lesbos, mainly after the fire in Moria camp, and they are closing the infamous refugee camps, state-run refugee camps like Vathi on the islands of Aegean. Almost for 2 years now. And while the numbers on the islands have significantly reduced, because today I just checked the numbers given for yesterday, in the totality of the islands, there are seemingly less than 3,000 people. And 2 years ago, we were talking about 45,000 people in the Aegean Islands. So there is a significant shift also. Of course, where did they go? What's happening on the mainland? This is a whole issue for maybe another discussion, obviously. But now, because as you well know, this is another important limitation to access to asylum, cultural, social rights, and etc. To begin with accommodation, but that aside, today we have less than 3,000 people on 5 hotspot islands: Chios, Kos, Samos, Leros, and Lesbos. And the Greek government, in collaboration with the EU authorities, are opening these closed, controlled access centers, in quotation, on the islands. In Kos, Samos, and Leros, they already been opened, and people are transferred to these spaces. In Lesbos, the discussion is much more complicated. There's rumors that the construction of the new camp in Vastria in the middle of the island is ongoing, but at the moment, the asylum seekers are held in Mavrovouni in Karatepe camp, which was established in a matter of few days after the fire in Moria. So anyways, in the previous program I did with Yorgos Christides, and with him, we focused on what actually is happening on the land and sea borders, the pushbacks, and all sorts of other human rights violations that the asylum seekers are facing at the borders. Today, I want to actually focus a little bit more on how these technologies of securitization are also practiced in the borderlands. If actually, any of the asylum seekers are able to access the Greek territories, they are not, collected and pushed back, as we discussed with Yorgos last time. Then when they are seeking asylum, they are held in these facilities. Many human rights organizations, for example, Amnesty, have reported on the camp in Samos, and it noted that the people who are living there argued that it is more like a prison for the people who are staying in these spaces. So you have visited all these camps in the past year. And so I want to go more in detail to understand how these spaces are constructed through the use of surveillance technologies. But first, I want to ask you the general overview, how these things are, constructed, what kind of funding is used, how the process is, and then maybe talk in general what kind of technologies are employed in these spaces.
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, we're talking about these closed, controlled access centers, and they're funded by the EU. And these are camps, as you said, for asylum seekers and refugees who have made it to the islands compared to, let's say, the more makeshift container and tent camps that we saw on Lesbos and other islands around 2015, 2016. These new closed camps are much more securitized, as you say. And this was a project, these camps were a project that were taken on by the EU in collaboration with Greek authorities after in the aftermath of the Moria fire on Lesbos in 2020. So far, there are 3 of them on Samos, Kos, and Leros. I have visited all 3, and they are constructing other ones, potentially one on Lesbos, Chios, and we can talk about other potential locations later on. So what makes these camps different from the kinds of structures we saw before is, as you say, the securitization, how securitized they are, how controlled they are. So ahead of our conversation, I dug out this pamphlet, this fact sheet that the Migration Ministry handed out to me and my colleagues who visited the opening of who were there for the opening of the Kos camp back in the fall of 2021, in November 2021. And so even if you look at their own materials, they're touting NATO type security fencing and all the technology that you need to go through to enter into one of these camps. So turnstiles, magnetic gates, x-rays, there's a 2-factor access control system. You need to have an ID card to enter, and you need to, scan your fingerprint to enter. And then once you enter inside these camps, there are all sorts of levels of other surveillance and security, like cameras and sensors. And all of this, the Migration Ministry argues, is to make these spaces safer for the residents, for the workers, and for the local communities. And as I mentioned, I have had a chance to go into all 3 of these new facilities. Mostly recently, I was on Leros last month in July, and I got a really quick tour, but a tour nonetheless of the facility there. And even in the 15, let's say, minutes that I spent going around, I mean, the surveillance is really palpable. Every few meters, as you walk around, you see cameras pointed at you on poles throughout the camp. And another thing that is striking, I think, if you visit these new structures, is the other sorts of security presence, like security guards, and the ratio of security guards to residents. So I just want to look up a couple of numbers here. So on Leros, for example, where I was last month, there were 110 residents, and I'm talking about asylum seekers and refugees, and 260 staff members, which includes private security staff, police, and Migration Ministry staff. But 110 asylum seekers, refugees, 260 staff members. And that's the case. Yeah, more than double. And that's the case, from what I understand, on the other islands as well. At least on Samos, the asylum seekers and refugees are outnumbered by the staff. And on Samos, when I went, it was striking. They told us, there's one security guard every 30 meters in this big sprawling camp. So you can imagine why the security is palpable, not just because of the technology, but because of the physical presence of guards. Another thing that is different about these new structures is that, I guess with the exception of Leros, is that they're pretty isolated. They're in, they're not in the center of the island, in a central spot where people can easily walk into town. They're pretty isolated. And that is, from what I understand, the plan for Lesbos as well. And because of everything I've just outlined, these camps have been quite scrutinized, as you know. And in fact, I think it's important to mention that even and not just scrutinized, not just by civil society and activist organizations. Just last month, the European Ombudsman launched an inquiry to figure out some of the questions that I think a lot of journalists and researchers have about these camps and the way in which fundamental rights are or are not upheld in these structures. Yeah.
And in terms of funding, where's the money coming from because this is the technology that is employed as well as the staff that is being employed. I mean, there is all sorts of these discussions about the employment of extraordinary numbers of police force in Greece in general. There is that discussion separate, but this is a huge sum of money to maintain that space, even though the numbers are low. And in the past, we were talking about the funding because we were talking about provision of food, provision of care, and etc., which wasn't being provided, but the authorities were discussing the expenses. But now the expense seems to be mainly focused on creating these. I mean, you didn't necessarily say it, but for me, this is no different than high controlled prisons, like closed prisons. Yes, people can get in and out, but the interior structure and the sense of feeling, in my observation, is nothing different than high controlled, in the United States, these, high security prisons that we speak of from the movies that I watch, seem to have less security than what we have in the camps. It's very expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you talk to anyone, I don't like to paint the experiences of people who are living in these camps with a broad brush, or to say that, they all are having the same experience. But I don't think I've talked to a single person who has lived in one of these camps who has not told me it feels like a prison. To me, it also looks like a prison. When I went in, I've never been held in a prison, but from what I've seen in the media, in movies, it looks exactly like that. And also, I think it's interesting that it's not just, again, the asylum seekers, refugees, and activists who are making these points, but even the people who have to work in these camps feel that impact of the prison-like surveillance. So in Samos, I'm not sure if you know, but if you saw that a few months ago, I think in the spring, a bunch of security personnel protested because they realized suddenly, oh, we have to go through some of the same security measures that the asylum seekers have to go through, and they didn't like it, and they went, they protested, they went on strike. Now, as for the funding, we know that the camps themselves are funded by the EU. So there was, an announcement a couple of years ago. There was this big pot of funding, 275 million euros, I think, that was going to for the construction of these camps. Where it gets less transparent and more iffy is exactly how some of these surveillance and security structures are funded. From what I've been able to gather from my own research, some of that funding does come from the EU, from COVID relief funds, and from the ISF fund, the Internal Security Fund. But this is actually a question that even the European Ombudsman is asking in their inquiry, is where, can you clarify exactly what sources of funding are being used to fund these? The European sources of funding are being used to fund these the surveillance tech and some of the security.
Yeah, and I'm like also thinking in terms of how corruption has been one of our major issues within Greece at the moment. And I'm in Lesbos, as you know, at the moment, and I'm talking to local people who are living here. And one of the first impressions I get is the issue of transparency. It's not just how this money, particularly how the money is being spent for all purposes with regards to encampment of asylum seekers and migration management. There's a serious lack of transparency at all areas of the migration management, but particularly when it comes to funding, when it comes to reimbursement, all sorts of other issues. There seems to be a very serious lack of transparency for the public in general, because these things should be able to be accessible for everyone to see, to a certain extent at least. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think there are also questions about the European Commission's role in all of this, and in making some of this transparent and accessible for the public to know. As you said, these new camps are a joint project between the EU and the Greek government. And I think it's notable. I keep mentioning this inquiry, but I think it's really notable because, the ombudsman is asking this question to the European Commission: how, exactly how have you been involved in the creation and in creating and overseeing these camps? Because in theory, the European Commission should be involved and should be reporting some of this. And I completely agree. Some of this should be much more transparent and easy to find for locals, for journalists, for researchers, and it's just not at the moment.
And this whole process of encampment is not particular to hotspot islands, right? So I don't want to go in detail, but I think from activists and refugees, I've been seeing that the Malakas camp has been walled a while back, and there are also improvements, so-called improvements from the government authorities' perspective, on other camps such as the one in Evros, the Flakio, I think. So can you tell me if this process is also, this high securitization is also moving more inwards as well?
Yeah, I would say so. And as you mentioned the refugee camp in Flakio in Evros, which is the region up north, the border region between Greece and Turkey. Yeah. I was there a couple weeks ago, partly to see the progress that's been made on this new camp. So basically, there's already a structure there, and the plan is to expand it and to make it into one of these closed and controlled centers. Officials told me they're going to be, they anticipated being done in October. And from what I've gathered, it is going to look very much like the structures that we see on the islands, on the 3 islands so far, on Samos and Leros. One question that I think is important that is still open-ended is to what extent people will be able to leave that camp. Asylum seekers and refugees who are in there will be able to leave, because in theory, at least on the islands, there are rules. People are supposed to be able to exit the camp during certain hours. There are parameters and there are rules, but they're supposed to be able to exit, go out to to the local town, go to the beach. I saw people doing those things on Leros when I was there last month. It's not clear whether that will be the case in Evros, in the new camp. And the way that an official justified that to me or described that to me is that on the islands, the kind of closed parameter of the camp includes the whole island, because the thinking is that if somebody leaves to go into town, they're on an island, they can't as easily leave the island, right? Whereas in Evros, the concern for officials is that if people leave, they won't be able to manage them as easily. But I think this gets to a bigger question about like the nature of these camps and whether they're closed or not. Because as you remember, as you know, when the European Commission first announced their construction, what was the wonky name? I've written it down because I can never remember it. They called them multi-purpose reception and identification centers, MPRICs. But what we've seen on the ground is, that's not the name that's even that's used in the camps. Yeah, if you look at any of the signage when you enter one of these camps, it says closed and controlled access center. So this is the question. Another question that, again, this inquiry is bringing up, because there's a disconnect between the rhetoric from the European side and the reality on the Greek side. And as you know, this has been a tension point for a while now between the EU and Greece.
And and in terms of human rights perspective, even though the Greek authorities say, they can leave in certain hours and come back and etc., especially for young people, if there are unaccompanied minors in the camp, will this amount to, detention of children, for example? These questions needs to be answered fully, but unfortunately, the inquiries don't seem to be resulting in independent independent investigations.
Absolutely. And I mean, even as we've alluded to, like even in the case of the islands that, in the case of the camps that do allow for some sort of exit entry, it gets quite arbitrary, right? Like there are cases when suddenly on Samos, we saw a few months ago, people were suddenly not allowed to do that. And so, yeah, that obviously that raises a lot of concerns in a place like Fylakio. If you're telling people they cannot leave at all, then that is a detention center. Yeah.
And that needs to be attended by different rule of law, probably, that we need to struggle against. When you were visiting these spaces, were you able to talk with any of the refugees or the locals who are in these areas? In any of these coast Leros, how do the refugees, asylum seekers, talk about their experiences within these spaces, as well as the locals who are on these islands? Because I remember that now Chios and Lesbos are the last ones to make, and remembering that these were the islands who actually, for a number of different and opposing reasons, protested against the construction of the new facilities, were still on hold, I think, in terms of it's slow. But I'm wondering how the locals in these other islands are responding, as well as the refugees.
Yeah. So in terms of speaking with asylum seekers and refugees, when you're in these, every time I visited one of these centers, I've had security on my back the whole time. And it's really hard, as you can imagine, to talk to people, or if you do get to talk to people, to have a good, honest conversation. So the way I would usually do it is wait outside of the camp a bit further down the road and hope to run into people who are coming in and out. And that's thankfully I have been able to talk to quite a few people.
Sorry to interrupt. I've heard this on and off, even in Mavrovouni camp in Lesbos. So even though the journalists are allowed to enter the camp with permission, they are taken on an official tour. You are not allowed to freely roam, I assume, the facilities. Correct. And you are not allowed to speak to the residents, or at least interview them.
Yeah, I have. So on Samos, which I visited with 2 colleagues, they had a security guard for each one of us, trailing us. We were allowed to speak to people, but of course, again, having security right behind you changes the dynamic. We tried to trail off a little bit, which worked for a few minutes, but not really. And they claim, again, the Greeks claim that they do this for our own security, even though we told them we feel totally safe being in this space. I have like 1 million cameras on me. They have security with you. In the other camps, on Kos, when I visited, it was during the opening, so they hadn't actually moved people in yet. And then on Leros, I wasn't allowed to talk to anyone at all. So obviously that really impacts my work as a journalist. If I am given permission, I would hope that I would be able to, at least get some distance from the officials to be able to talk to people. But that's been my experience so far, either not being allowed to talk to refugees, or being allowed to talk, but with someone, right behind us listening in on the conversation.
Sorry to interrupt, because this is in terms of reporting human rights violations, for independent investigations, for all of us, access to produce knowledge. This is a huge limitation to information in many senses. So I thought this needs to be highlighted. But go on with how locals and refugees that you were able to speak to respond.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree. And so I was saying, I've had a chance to talk to quite a few refugees as they're exiting the camps, going into town. And as I said before, I think the overarching theme is that most of these people, when you try to talk to them about the experience of living in these camps, most of them will describe the experience like being in a prison. At the same time, I think, I've talked to several people who have told me, look, it does feel like a prison, but at the same time, I feel a bit safer having some sort of security presence there, because it could prevent, let's say, violence, sexual violence, things that we did see happening in the previous structures, the previous refugee camps. Now, I think for the asylum seekers, though, too, there's like two dual realities that I think are hard to square for them, right? Like they're in these really brand new, shining, high tech, multi-million dollar facilities. All this money is being poured into the glitzy tech, the fences, this and that. And yet at the same time, their daily needs aren't necessarily being met. Samos again is a great example of this. A few months ago, what was it, for 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, there was no running water in the camp. And this is a 40+ million euro facility that has, again, like the latest technology, but people can't get access to water. So in Leros, I had a chance to speak with a group of asylum seekers and refugees from Syria and Afghanistan. And what they told me was that the food wasn't adequate and that they were also surprised that they weren't provided things like clothing. They had been in the same clothes for weeks. And these are things that, as you know, historically NGOs have provided for asylum seekers and refugees. They have filled those gaps, whether it comes to food, education classes, art classes, clothing. And I think this is another one of the impacts of these closed centers. NGOs cannot as easily have direct access to the refugees and vice versa. And when I was on Leros, I shadowed what was the last NGO worker on the island as she was packing up this operation through which they would give clothing and food and classes to refugees. But they're not able to do that anymore because, as I said, the structures are closed. There are also, ethical and philosophical considerations that they have about operating in the camps, and they don't want to, given that they describe them like prisons. And then the Migration Ministry too has made it a bit harder for these NGOs to operate in the camps. So all of this, is interconnected and impacts the experience of people there.
Yeah. This has been very important reminder, I think, that we've been forgetting about how NGOs are literally exiled out of the islands.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And how about the locals? How are their responses to these new centers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we've seen on Lesbos, as we've seen in Evros around the construction of Phylakio, there's always protests, or these camps are announced or in the process of being built. Partly by these protests, I think, there's like far-right extremist groups that tend to participate in them. And then there's also activists with more humanitarian concerns, I would say, who are concerned about building these kinds of camps on their islands. I think what's interesting is that, once these camps are built, they're a bit out of sight, out of mind for most people, right? Because of their location. With the exception of Leros, on a day-to-day, the average person does not see the Ghost camp, does not see the camp on Samos. You have to very intentionally drive there and see it. And so I think while there is a lot of resistance initially, eventually it becomes a bit of a forgotten issue, in my experience, for the general population, with the exception being Leros. And I know you want to talk about Leros a bit more at some point.
We can actually even move on to that right away, because Leros is such an exceptional case. I mean, in all of the islands, I don't know the plans in Chios, but in all of the islands, as you said, it's out of sight and out of contact, and completely remote areas. In Lesbos, the planned site is right next to the landfill for the rubbish of the island, as you know, but for our audiences as well. But Leros is literally in the middle of the city center. In Lucky is the city, right? Lucky.
Exactly, Lucky Port.
And also, I mean, I'm really amazed by its geography, because as you and I also discussed as before, it's right in front of the former mental hospital, next to the old hospital. But then Leros has this whole history as a geography of a state of exclusion. So I'm very curious, and I would like to also show the viewers the photographs you've also taken from Leros as you speak.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, exactly as you said, unlike the other islands where the camps are in remote locations, kind of isolated on Leros, the camp is uh, right in the island's main port. So, like, if you take a ferry to come into the island, this is the first thing that you see. And like with a lot of islands, the port, there's lots of restaurants and shops and cafes, and if you sit there at night, uh, when the camp is lit up, all the floodlights are on. It looks like literally a spaceship landed there. I mean, this is how one local described it to me, and I think it's the perfect description, as you can see in the pictures too. And so I walked around that port, and I talked to shop owners and locals. And one thing that restaurant owners kept saying is that when tourists come into town and they sit down to have their beer or their meal, they'll look across and they'll see this like really imposing lit up structure, and they'll ask, "Oh, what is it? Like, can we go visit?" Because they think it's like a tourist attraction they can visit. That's honestly what it looks like. And it's a little funny. It's a bit of a local joke. But in reality, for a lot of locals, it's also a painful reminder of the island's history. As you said, it was Leros is this super fascinating history that I could not possibly get into. But just over the last 100 years, it's been an island that during the Greek military junta, it's where they would send exiles as prisoners. It's also where this psychiatric asylum operated for years until it was shut down in the 90s because journalists revealed the really, really horrible, squalid conditions inside. And so one local said to me, Leros has this history as this place of forced outcasts and exiles, and we see this camp as a continuation and perpetuation of that, when we would rather, for example, invest our time and energy into making it a more more touristy island. And of course, at the same time, what complicates all of this is that this camp that's there, that's impossible to miss, is a major employer, right? Like there are at least 260 jobs, as I said, going to locals on an island of about 8,000 people. So it's a lot of realities that the locals have to square. But I think overall, especially on Leros, it's a really unique place because this camp, it's impossible to miss.
Yeah, this is definitely where I want to move next in terms of working. I'm super curious as a geographer. This is fascinating in a very complicated emotional way, I guess, for me, but super fascinating. Final question is, of course, how this gets all centralized, because you've also been in Athens in this control room headquarters, I would say. I don't know what the name is officially, where the Greek authorities are able to monitor the entire system of camps throughout the country. So, can you tell me how this centralization functions? What is the space like?
Sure. Yeah. So I had a chance to visit this centralized control room that's here in Athens in the migration building, Migration Ministry building, back in December with my colleague Kenya Jade Pinto, who's a documentary filmmaker. And when you walk into this room, it's just walls of screens, and you can see this control room is connected to all of this tech that I described at the camps, the cameras, the sensors, different things. I mean, there's literally a joystick that they let us, toggle with in the control room, where you can select, Samos camp, Gos camp, Leros, and going to different spaces and see what's going on. And so this is part of a part of the system that the Migration Ministry has built called Centaur, which is one of the things I'm looking into through through my fellowship at the Pulitzer Center. And this system is an automated threat detection system. And in theory, what it's supposed to do is to take in data from all these technologies and use algorithms sophisticated algorithms, as the Migration Ministry described them, to automatically detect threats. So when we interviewed the self-described architect of Centaur, he told us that a threat could be, a camera could spot a large group of people gathering in one place, or it could spot what looks like a weapon, someone holding a weapon, and it would automatically alert local authorities and authorities in Athens. Some of the things that they were planning to do or plan to do, or maybe are already doing, it's not clear, is to, for example, equip guards in the camps with augmented reality glasses and deploy drones to the scene of these threats so that they can get a better image of what's going on the ground in the camps, and guide the guards and the people on the ground through how to solve whatever situation is going on. And I mean, you can imagine why this raises a lot of alarm bells for civil society, digital rights organizations.
The next and final question I want to ask is actually the ethical concerns that are being raised for especially the application of this Centaur in Athens.
Yeah, so I mean, with Centaur in particular, there's this group called Homo Digitalis, which is a Greek civil liberties organization focusing on digital rights, that filed a complaint to the Greek Data Protection Authority because there's so little transparency about how the system operates, whether the right data impact assessments were done that are legally required, whether those were done before the system was deployed. And so now this Data Protection Authority is investigating this system. And so we'll have to, I'm trying to answer a lot of these questions through my reporting. But I think it's important to note that the system is under investigation. And then more broadly, when we talk about the use of really any smart automated AI technology, there are people like my colleague Petra Molnar, who have done really excellent, Petra Molnar with the Migration and Tech Monitor, who are doing great work on this, who are looking at both the legal and ethical concerns around this technology, because we know it's full of biases, the same biases that exist in our world. We know that this technology can be misused for human rights violations. Like, I don't know if you saw that there was a Human Rights Watch report just a few days ago looking at how Frontex used its aerial surveillance systems in the Mediterranean to assist with pushbacks. So this technology, even though authorities will tell you it's used to ensure the safety of people, it's actually often misused. And so I think, the use of these technologies and the securitization, militarization of the border and of the migration space, whether we're talking about the border or settings like refugee camps, are both legally and ethically questionable.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. Is there anything else you want to add to finish up, or is there anything you want to add?
I don't think so. I think I had some bullet points, and I think we covered everything.
Great. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for joining the program. And good luck with the Pulitzer Fellowship. This is really, and congrats again, obviously. Thank you. And thank you for everyone who's been watching us. Please follow the program on Medyascope Plus. And in 2 weeks, we'll see you again. Have a good Sunday and a good week. Thank you for watching us.
Thank you for having me on.